Well, good morning, everybody. It's September the 19th of 2020. My name's Chris Young, and I'm one of the park rangers here at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. And this is our live question and answer session with park historian Jim Ogden. And in case you haven't been following us, today is the actual 157th anniversary of the first full day of fighting during the Battle of Chickamauga. And they're falling this year on the actual dates. So Saturday and Sunday of 2020 line up with Saturday and Sunday of 1863. So that's something very interesting and special for us who are working here at the battlefield. Again, we're setting in one of the rooms in the operations building at Chickamauga Battlefield. We have the bookshelves on our side. We have a picture above us of the Snodgrass House, and one of the guns, our cannon, of the 4th U.S. Artillery that's stationed up there at Snodgrass Hill. Again, just to kind of give our format here, you're more than welcome to ask questions live on YouTube and live on our Facebook page, and we'll get those in real time to Jim Ogden so that he can answer those questions. If you did watch his segment just a few moments ago of the fighting at Jay's Mill, now would be a great time to ask those first morning battle questions specific to what was happening during the morning of September 19th of 1863. You may also notice that we had a little bit of a glitch yesterday with our first Q&A on Facebook. We tried to cut that yesterday, and that is going to be re-uploaded soon. Also, yesterday afternoon session Q&A with Jim Ogden wasn't recorded on YouTube. So for all of those YouTube followers out there, we will be moving the Facebook Live that we recorded and putting that up on YouTube so that you can watch it from there as well. So we're going to get all of this squared away and straightened out. We appreciate everyone following and joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Jim to come in and start our Q&A session. Jim?
Thank you, Chris, and good morning to everyone, and welcome back for those who watched any of the sessions yesterday. And I appreciate your participation in this program that the National Military Park is offering this year as we virtually recognize the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga.
So we talked a little bit about this yesterday, Jim. The first question that I have this morning is, on the morning of September the 19th, what was Nathan Bedford Forrest's role that morning, and how did the battle really get kicked off? And should Forrest have really been where he was? I know that Forrest loves to lead from the front. Was that maybe to his detriment in some cases?
Yes, in this case, it will turn out to be an issue for the Confederates. Braxton Bragg, on the morning of September the 19th, still believed that the Union left flank would be located in the area of Lee and Gordon's Mill. And Bragg himself had come onto the battlefield early that morning and was riding around amongst the troops that had crossed the creek the day before. William Henry Talbot Walker's men, John Bell Hood's men, Buckner's men, and was explaining to those commanders that they should prepare, position their troops to, on order, resume the movement towards Lee and Gordon's Mill. Well, while that is going on, and even just before dawn, Nathan Bedford Forrest, wanting to investigate what some pre-dawn, early morning contact in the woods south of Jay's Mill and north of the rear of where Walker's troops were camped, what that contact might indicate. And he had ordered his division commander, John Pegram, to bring Pegram's own brigade, which is soon going to be under the command of Henry Davidson, who arrives that morning, bring them onto the field and probe northward to try to find out what it was that had caused this pre-dawn contact. And that results in that skirmish action, that fighting around Jay's Mill. And Forrest, as you note, Chris, being a man of action, being a man who likes to be in his military training and experience, is coming through actual contact with the enemy, and that's often very costly to his soldiers. Forrest himself is going to be right there at Jay's Mill, and when that action expands with contact with John Crookston's troops, which George Thomas sends out from the Kelly Field area, Forrest becomes very focused on the enemy in his front, and also not fully understanding what it was exactly that Bragg was trying to do. Ideally, Forrest fails to really recognize how that expanding engagement indicates that the Union Army has moved further north overnight, and his call for reinforcements, and again his mere focus on the enemy troops in the woods west of Jay's Mill, is going to start setting the stage for that very different Battle of Chickamauga to open. The Battle of Chickamauga, that is basically the history books battle today, and certainly not that battle that Braxton Bragg had wanted to fight, although, as noted earlier, Bragg's understanding of the battlefield by the morning of the 19th is really out of date. He having failed to anticipate that if he does something to his enemy, they are likely to respond, react in some way.
All right, thanks, Jim. So if anyone has additional questions, please feel free to get those to us right now. The other question that I have, Jim, is in case people weren't watching the 10 o'clock program, when you refer to Jay's Mill, when we're out on the battlefield, we typically refer to the beginning of the battle occurring on the 19th at Jay's Mill. I think that some people think that they're going to drive down and be able to see the ruins. Like tomorrow morning, I'll be down at Glass Mill, where we can see some of the remnants of the mill. I think that sometimes we get in our mind when we drive out there that we're looking for a mill, like a grist mill. Who was Jay? What kind of mill was that? And what might the operations of that mill actually been? What was the benefit of it, if we can ask?
Yeah. The most common description of that has become simply Jay's Mill. However, a number of participants at the time are actually more specific about that mill, and in a lot of ways, I wish we could use their language and get that into to common usage. But it was a steam sawmill, Jay's steam sawmill. One source even says Underwood's steam sawmill, but Jay's steam sawmill, and it literally was a I'll say portable, but it was not as portable as that term today would suggest. It was a movable, a relocatable sawmill. With the advancement in steam engine technology in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, it had become possible to develop a steam engine, essentially almost all of the components of what you would think of as a Civil War era steam locomotive, the firebox, the boiler, and then the cylinder and the drive wheel. But instead of the drive wheel being on the track and driving the engine or the locomotive forward, this drive wheel was merely a large wheel that turned, from which a leather belt could then be run to some other piece of equipment. You begin to see thrashing machines and other agricultural machines that can be operated from these movable or relocatable steam engines. But you also see sawmills so that literally you can take the sawmill operation to the area where you are cutting the trees and cut trees. We don't know fully what it was Jay was doing there cutting timber. However, with the war going on, with the Western Atlantic Railroad just being 6 or 7 miles to the east of Jay's mill, with Chattanooga having been the Confederate base for so many months, there was a tremendous need for wood products in this area. The locomotives were voracious. I don't know that they would have been cutting locomotive fuel and hauling it that distance, but that we still can't entirely reject that possibility. But cutting other timber for railroad use. Railroad ties are increasingly being cut by sawmill or by steam-powered sawmills. Cutting timber for bridges, for flooring bridges. Just before the battle, Bragg directs that the Western Atlantic Railroad Bridge over the Oostenaula River at Resaca be floored to facilitate the movement of wheeled vehicles, particularly if he had to retreat south of the Oostenaula River. In Chattanooga, the Confederates have already built large numbers of frame hospital buildings and are building more even as they abandon the city. So there's a lot of need for lumber. In fact, about a mile to the west of Jay's Mill, just north of the open Brock Field, there was an area that had a lot of, it's variously described as fallen timber or felled timber. And that's not typically the way a farmer cleared a field. And so that it is possible that the Brocks were expanding their field by having sold the saw logs from the timber on that area to Jay to then be cut up at the sawmill. Part of the field there is described as having stumps in it. So the producing sawn lumber for one purpose or another, and again, with the railroad being just 6 or 7 miles to the east, certainly you would have a means to move that somewhere, but also you had a huge consumer of wood products just 6 or 7 miles to the east as well.
Thanks, Jim. So one of the other questions, during this brief period of Union occupation of Chattanooga prior to the battle, before Bragg starts his siege of the town, were Union troops supplied through Bridgeport, Alabama?
Yes, with Union occupation of Chattanooga on September the 9th, one of the things that Rosecrans immediately begins to direct, and in fact, in some ways, it was already beginning to happen just naturally because the primary occupation force are going to be elements of Tom Crittenden's 21st Corps. And when they had crossed the river out at principally Shell Mound, they had already begun to reorient their line of communications, their supply route, to go from Stevenson to Bridgeport and then to come along the road, the railroad that, or the road that ran along the railroad between Bridgeport and Chattanooga. And Rosecrans begins to redirect reorient the line of communications, the line of supply along that same route as well. And so for Wagner's brigade, as they cross the river, their line of communication will be reoriented to that route from Bridgeport as the Pioneer Battalion troops come in, the first of the 1st Michigan Engineers and Mechanics troops who arrive there, they also begin to draw their supplies directly from Bridgeport.
Thanks, Jim. Did Hood push forward on the Alexander Vineyard Road at daybreak? And if not, why?
Before daybreak on the 19th, Braxton Bragg has arrived on the battlefield, and he will soon thereafter communicate with Hood, who is now an acting corps commander, commanding a small corps of 2 divisions. Bushrod Johnson's provisional division, which has been reduced in size just down to Johnson, McNair's, and Gregg's brigade directly under Johnson's command, and then the 3 brigades that had arrived from Virginia, the 2 that had not participated on the 18th, Bennings and Law's brigades, will cross the creek and march forward and join Robertson's brigade. So Hood has a small corps of 2 divisions, and Bragg tells Hood and Buckner and Walker that they are to position their troops, and particularly Buckner and Hood in the on the front line will adjust the positioning of their troops, but they are to position their troops to await the order from Bragg to then launch the assault at Lee and Gordon's Mill. So while Hood around dawn is causing troops, particularly Johnson's division, to reposition from where they had overnight, he does not make any forward move because he has not yet received that order from Bragg.
Thanks, Jim. Another person asked, they say, I must admit that I'm new to the battle, having visited for the first time on Labor Day. Do you believe that even more decisive victory for the Confederacy would have led to a negotiated peace because of throwing off the timeline for taking Atlanta?
Oh boy, that's
well, historians really don't like to do the what ifs. I mean, that's one of the things is that they're kind of hard.
Right.
But I don't know if we could maybe briefly speak to something on what what you saw happening at the time.
Right.
Maybe not a what if, but here's something that we know, and if this had
the further we go forward in time, the more difficult, because you get a lot more factors. But if you go back to what Bragg's plan was, the idea of getting the Confederate Army in between the Union Army in Chattanooga and crushing Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland against the wall of Lookout Mountain to the southwest of what is today the scene of what became the Battle of Chickamauga, then it is possible to see that the Confederates could well have had a much more decisive victory. They could have defeated, even badly damaged, as Bragg hoped, destroy the Union Army of the Cumberland, and perhaps the more significant that damage to the Army of the Cumberland, the greater likelihood that it could have forced the Rosecrans to withdraw back over the mountains, over the Tennessee River, to the north side, which could have stretched out then any sort of timeline for what comes after. You do have to remember that in July and August of 1863, there is a great deal of unrest, civil disobedience in the North. The greatest example of this are the draft riots in New York City, where troops of the Army of the Potomac, which have been successful outside that small south central Pennsylvania college town of Gettysburg in early July, where they have to be sent to help quell the rioting, the draft rioting in New York. There is similar resistance to the execution of the draft in cities in Ohio, in Indiana, and Illinois. There are murders of draft officials, all of which are things that indicate that Northern popular support for the war was at a relatively low ebb, even with the success of having captured Vicksburg and turned back the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg. There are congressional elections coming up in the fall in some states, gubernatorial elections in some states, including Ohio. The Lincoln administration does have some concern about the extent to which there is continued popular support for the prosecution of the war. So a very decisive Confederate victory here in the form of a badly damaged or even destroyed Union Army could have really even further affected Northern morale. We can't say for certain that that it would have caused the Lincoln administration to enter into negotiations, because the North had not yet even fully mobilized all of its effective or potential combat power. But it could well have changed the course of the war. It certainly would have revived a lot of spirits within the Confederacy.
Thanks, Jim. I think that the last question that I see is concerning, let's go back to September the 19th now, and look at Colonel Dan McCook. Did Colonel McCook ever get a promotion for his actions for that morning, or of that morning, and how did he rise? And what happens to Dan McCook? Yeah. Let's just talk about that also, if you don't mind, at the end.
Yeah, Dan McCook, one of the famous fighting McCooks, is indeed looking for his star. He is looking to be promoted beyond just being colonel of the 52nd Ohio. But at the time of his mortal wounding on June 27, 1864, assaulting the Confederate lines at Kennesaw Mountain, what is known today as the Dead Angle area, where the Illinois Monument there stands at Cheatham Hill. He is still just colonel of the 52nd Ohio. He does, let's see, his commission as brigadier general is dated before his death, and I'm trying to remember now whether at the time of his death he had actually learned of that promotion. But during the time of his field service, he is still just colonel, his ability as an officer, potential brigade commander, brigadier general, is recognized, and he does retain brigade command until his mortal wounding in June of 1864.
Thanks, Jim. So looking at everything, it looks as though we have no more questions up right now, which is probably good. We're looking at 10 after 11 now. So we're going to try to keep these question and answer sessions between 15 and 20 minutes. And for all of those that may have questions that haven't been able to ask them this morning of Jim Ogden, please join us this afternoon at 2:45 after Jim's 2 o'clock program to ask those questions of us this afternoon. So we do appreciate you joining us today, and we hopefully will see you all again at 2:45. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.